Hello, my name's Kate Redshaw, and I'm a senior lawyer in the employment team at Burgess Salmon. And I'm delighted to be joined again today by familiar face Luke Bowery, one of our partners. And Luke, it's great to have you back in the hot seat. And today we're talking about a really interesting topic that I know will be on a lot of employers' minds, and that's the move potentially to hybrid working. And as lockdown eases, employers are really starting to focus on how and where their people will work. And we've had many people working from home now for over a year. And I think lots of employers are seeing this as an opportunity to really reimagine the working environment when we all start to return. And moving employees to permanent home working arrangements, even if they're not full-time home working arrangements, is not straightforward. And of course, considerations as to how the office will look in the future go beyond employment considerations. Much is going to depend on the people's property, the leases, the nature of their business, how that business has changed during COVID, and so on. But today, Luke, I'd like to pick your brains on the employment issues. Perhaps we could look at some of the pros and cons of hybrid working, some of the potential, if I can call them this, bear traps, and also some of the contractual issues which are bound to arise along the way.
Yeah, well, hi, Kate. It is good to be speaking again on, as what you say, it's a fantastic topic with so many factors in play. I think for me, it's a little bit surreal. As you say, we've been at home for so long now that I think you'd be forgiven if you were an employer saying, well, what's the problem? Why don't we just carry on as we are? But I think as we see the country and the world start to reopen, I think people's behaviours, expectations will change. And in reality, we're already starting to see that, aren't we?
Yeah, no, that's right. In fact, talking about what we're starting to see, Luke, what can you share with us in terms of market practice, both I guess in terms of what the market in general is doing, and also what we've seen our clients starting to do?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think the first point to note is we are starting to see more employers make concrete decisions. I think up until recently, there has been definitely an element of sort of wait and see. But I think with the vaccination program still galloping on, I think that has emboldened many employers, given them more confidence to press go and start to firm up what their new ways of working might look like. So, for example, recently we had Nationwide announce their work anywhere plan. I think this week PwC have announced a whole raft of flexible working measures. And we've seen numerous other professional services firms, including law firms, sort of commit to percentages of time in and out of the office in any working week. Amongst our own client base, no surprise, we've seen a range of responses. At one end of the spectrum, we have a few, fair to say not too many, who are choosing to close their workspaces entirely and get everyone working from home permanently. Other end of the spectrum, we've got clients who are looking to get the majority of their teams back for most of the time. But I think perhaps unsurprisingly, what we're seeing the most are employers looking to move to some sort of hybrid model, with employees will spend some time in the office and some time working from home.
Yes, that's certainly where a lot of the conversations have been focused, isn't it? So let's look at that hybrid working model then, Luke. I mean, because that's the one, frankly, I think most employers are going to be looking to adopt. So what benefits do you think that this offers to employers?
Well, I think there's a number. If you pick one out for me, it's probably recruitment and retention. It's fair to say it's not suited everyone, but we do know many employees have really welcomed being able to work from home, particularly those with long commutes, childcare, other commitments outside of work. So I think if employers aren't looking to replicate some of that flexibility moving forward, they may risk losing people, losing key talent. And I think there's also a risk they'll find it harder to recruit in the future.
Yes, no, I can see that. And I guess for some employers, there's going to be an advantage of actually having a wider geographical pool to fish from, if I can put it like that. And I mean, there are other benefits, aren't they? Some organisations may be looking to reduce their space, but there's been lots of talk about redesigning the workplace, talking about collaboration spaces and so on. And, all is actually sounding really exciting.
Well, yeah, that's right, Kate. I guess how you get the best out of your office space is another subject altogether, which I suspect you or I aren't best qualified to talk about. But it is exciting. As I say, there are other benefits. I think statistics and surveys show there is evidence of increased productivity from those working from home or having a mix. You've got the saved commuting time and associated costs, potentially maybe more upskilled IT or technology awareness amongst your workforce. And I think importantly, in lots of cases, if not all, you have got, I think, increased levels of motivation and maybe trust between the employer and the employee.
Yes, and I suppose also the advantage to home working is no more snow days, Luke.
Well, absolutely.
But I mean, it's not all roses, is it? Working from home in this hybrid model. I know you just mentioned productivity, but actually, I've seen a bit of commentary going the other way, where there's starting to be more employers looking to increase their use of monitoring tools to keep an eye on what their home workers are doing. And I think I saw a report last week in one of the papers that there's one organisation is looking to actually install webcams on their people working from home, so they can keep an eye on exactly what's going on. So there seems to be a little bit of concern that home workers might be slacking off.
Yeah, probably unfair in the wider circumstances, but you're right. The issue of employee monitoring again is a completely different topic in itself, and I think one we're going to see become more and more prominent just because of the circumstances and what employers are looking to do. I think on a wider basis, though, you're right. If you're looking at what your future working model should look like, it's really important you take into account what the potential downsides might be and try and mitigate against them. Equally, I think you've got to look at what's worked well and not worked so well in your own organization over the last year. I think in terms of wider downsides for me, I think as the lockdown's gone on, I think statistics have shown that more and more people are struggling with the lack of face-to-face contact with colleagues. We're all humans. Most of us like the camaraderie. We like the collaborative nature of working in teams. We like getting out of the house. We like the after-work socials and so on. Probably some more than others, Kate, I might say as well. I guess the other key, I miss a key point that's worth reinforcing here as well, though. I think we mustn't forget for trainees, maybe less experienced workers, in my view, they're really missing out on valuable training opportunities, because I think it is more difficult to learn on the job remotely, in the same way as you would when you're in the office surrounded by your colleagues, learning by osmosis, etc. So that's going to be an important issue and thinking point moving forward.
No, absolutely agree with that. It's been really tough, I think, for people who have starting training contracts or graduate schemes whilst we've all been working remotely to get that hands-on experience. So lots of reasons there, Luke, to try and find a happy medium which combines some office-based working, but also allows the flexibility for people to work from home as and when they need to. So if I'm an employer looking to move towards a more flexible way of working, how do I go about deciding what might work?
Nice, easy question. Well, it's one we're all grappling with, as we've already identified. There's a load of factors to throw into the mix. I guess the truth is that no one really knows how hybrid working will work in practice. We know now that when we're all at home, we can work pretty well. But how that translates when some are in work and others aren't, I think is more challenging in my view. And I think for that reason, there may well be some employers who actually hold fire for now and don't introduce new policies quite yet, or maybe choose to pilot a scheme before committing to any permanent arrangements. And as I say, the reason for that is I just think it's quite difficult to second guess how these arrangements will actually pan out in the short, medium and longer term. So what will it do to the culture of an organisation if people aren't in there seeing each other regularly? What will happen if the people actually in the office are the younger people under 30, say, with older people preferring to work from home? And we are starting to see some statistics which show that could potentially be the case. So in my view, unless there may be a real risk of losing staff now if you don't commit to one route or the other, or if there aren't other burning platforms like lease renewals for your office premises, those sorts of things, then there's certainly something to be said for just taking a bit of time and really deciding what might work, because this is a really business critical decision. And the final point I'd say there is one other thing to think about is that I do think some organizations might end up with different hybrid models in different parts of their business, depending on what type of work is actually being performed by their employees.
Yeah, that's an interesting thought, Luke. What's better than one hybrid model way of working than two?
Well, yeah, let's
And
not keep it simple.
I suppose employers, I mean, one obvious thing to do really isn't it, is to do staff surveys or consult with your employees to find out also, I guess, what they're looking for, because it's difficult to second guess these things.
Yeah, I agree. It makes perfect sense to me for a couple of reasons. The first is I think you might be surprised by some of the results, and it's
Mm.
obviously going to inform your thinking. And I think from a maybe employment law perspective, if you've got evidence to back up any decisions and you've shown that you've canvassed employee views, I think that can potentially put you in a stronger position further down the line if you do need to make changes to terms and conditions to accommodate any hybrid working arrangements you're looking to put into place.
Which is actually, Luke, a brilliant segue into what I want to look at next, which is actually the contractual position under the employment contract. So if an employer does want to move their employees to full or partial home working, obviously there are contractual implications to that. And I suppose actually just something as an aside it's worth mentioning is, of course, this move to hybrid working works alongside people's flexible working arrangements that they already have in place, perhaps through making a flexible working request. So you've got to bear that in mind. I don't want to go into that now, Luke, because we haven't really got time, but I might do a little plug for our video, our conversation that we recorded a little while back on flexible working and those rights. So you can find that video, if you haven't seen it already, on our Burgess Salmon YouTube channel. But back to what we were saying, Luke, to what extent is the move to permanent home working a change to the contract of employment? Sorry. I mean, I guess an employer who is choosing to shut up shop altogether, so employees are going to work from home full time. I mean, that's surely got to be a variation to the contract, which gets you into the territory of needing consent to the change and so on. Is that right?
Yeah, I think you're probably right in that scenario, Kate. If you've got an employer saying to employees who pre-pandemic came into the office all the time to work, there's going to be no office moving forwards, that's likely to be a fundamental change to terms and conditions of employment. Not only is the workplace changing slash disappearing, but also the way in which the employee works, the environment they're working in is fundamentally changing. So I think in those scenarios, the safest course is certainly going to be to go down the consent route. And I think that's probably arguably the case, even if you've got a well-drafted mobility clause in your contract of employment.
Yeah, is there any mileage in the argument to say, well, actually, everybody's been working from home since March 2020. You've already agreed to that change to your contract.
Yeah, I have seen that floated in a couple of places. My own view is it probably wouldn't work because unless the employer was really clear at the outset that home working was going to be a permanent change, which, let's face it, was probably unlikely if you cast your minds back, I think an employee would simply say that any consent they gave was for a temporary change, even if that temporary state of affairs has lasted a lot longer than we would have all liked, of course. The other important point, which we've not touched on here, is I don't want to be too doom and gloom, but employers in this position where they're looking to completely close their office just need to know they could very well fall within the legal definition of a redundancy situation as well.
Oh gosh, yes, no, of course. And I mean, I suppose thinking it through, I guess there would be arguments that the home working role was suitable alternative employment, but whether or not that would work would depend on individual circumstances. And I suppose whilst we're on the doom and gloom, Luke, I guess you might also trigger collective consultation requirements if your numbers are 20 or more.
Well, yeah, you're right. Expensive consequences in terms of protective awards if you get it wrong, as you well know.
Yeah. Well, let's look at the more common scenario, I think, which is going to be employers who choose to allow their employees the opportunity to work from home if they want to, but with a requirement, say, to come into the office, for a minimum number of days per week. Is that a variation to the contract of employment which might need consent?
Potentially, I think there are a few scenarios to consider there. So if the employees are going to have complete freedom, say, to choose where they work on any particular day, I think you'd argue that there hasn't been a change at all on the basis that the employee could, in theory, work in the office every day if they wanted to. And even if there was a change in that scenario, you'd probably say it's in the employee's favour. It's just giving them greater flexibility as to where they work. I think where it gets more tricky and more complicated is if the employer is seeking to restrict how often an employee can come into the office. That might be, for example, if you're reducing your floor plate and you can't accommodate all the employees you used to at any given time. And I think whether that's a fundamental change to terms and conditions will depend on the individual circumstances, but I could certainly see it amounting to a detrimental change in some instances. And you'd be back to thinking about consent and even potential those collective consultation requirements if the numbers are there and you are looking at potential dismissal and re-engagement were the employees ultimately particularly not to give their consent. Again, I suppose if you had a mobility clause, you might try and argue that you're not technically operating a variation to the contract, but I think you'd want to review those clauses carefully. I think they need to be pretty tightly drafted. And even then, you'd still have your wider obligations to act reasonably, consult in good faith, those sorts of things.
Yeah, no, you're right to be cautious there. But I mean, let's put our happy faces on, Luke, because I suspect in real terms, employers may well find employees are happy to work to a hybrid model. It works for them as well as for the employer, in which case the employer can simply write to employees, I guess, giving details of the new arrangements and hope that consent will be forthcoming. In which case, Luke, what will employers need to be thinking about in terms of the changes that might need to be made to that written contract of employment? I mean, we won't have time to go through this in detail, but can we explore some of the key points? Yeah,
of course. I mean, there's a couple of points which immediately spring to mind. I guess the first one, the obvious one, is the place of work provision and what you do with that.
Yes, because I suppose there's a requirement, isn't there, for in the written particulars, the statement of written particulars, you have to state where the employee's place of work is. So place of work will currently be their office. Should employers be looking to change that if these people are going to be working from home?
Again, it's going to depend on the employer's individual plans. As a general rule, I think if it's credible and feasible to do so, I think you'd probably want to keep the employee's place of work as the office and include relevant provisions as to when they'll be working from home, for example, when it's reasonable to do so with relevant consent from the line manager, those sorts of things. I think it's important to remember that Section 1 of the Employment Rights Act does say that written particulars need to include the place of work, but also where the employee is required or permitted to work at various places, an indication of that, and also the address of the employer. And also Section 4 of the Employment Rights Act also technically requires any changes to be notified in writing and within 1 month of the change. So you've got to think about that. In terms of the home location, work location piece, the other point, bit of a techie point, is just thinking about working time. So if the employee's place of work is their home, then if they do need to leave their home for work, then arguably the clock starts ticking for their working time the minute they leave the home, even if that is to travel to the office. There might also be some tax issues from permanent home working. So it's certainly one to think about and try and reflect the reality of what's going to happen on the ground.
You've been doing your homework there, Luke, with those section numbers and everything.
You know me.
And I guess that brings me neatly to the next point I wanted to discuss, which is how employers should frame their requirements in terms of when the employee is needed to come into work and who should dictate that.
Yep. I mean, this is a key point, isn't it? This is the crux of it, really. Again, it's going to depend on what model the employer decides to adopt, from complete flexibility to more regulated requirements. I don't think you need chapter and verse in the contract or the side letter. I think it's probably a mix between the contract and probably a home working, hybrid working policy, which would cover off some of these points, and that may give you a bit more flexibility. But I think either way, whatever, I think the important point is you're making clear any de minimis requirements in your contract or your variation letter as to when you expect and how you expect employees to come into work. I think, as we've said, there could be a whole variance depending on the type of employer, the type of employees on that. But I think you want to be absolutely clear on your expectations to avoid any misunderstandings. I think the only other point I'd say there is also just to think about line management. And I've seen quite a lot of commentary on this about if you're introducing hybrid arrangements. There's plenty of research, as we've alluded to, saying that maybe women and older workers are likely to be the ones more keen to continue working from home, whilst the younger population might want to be more back in the office for the training development things we've discussed. So I think you are going to have to actively monitor that on the ground and be careful in that scenario that just because you're in the office, you don't necessarily get the preferential treatment, the better pieces of work because you're more visible.
Yeah, there's been a lot of talk about the two-tier workforce, haven't there, and the kind of out of sight, out of mind. And, you know, with my employment lawyer hat on, it's a discrimination case potentially waiting to happen if line managers aren't fair with their distribution of work. And, you know, you can see why, if somebody's in the next door office, why it's easier just to pop in and see them and give the work out. So I guess what that means is that line managers are going to need to be properly briefed on how to manage these hybrid teams, from not just work allocation, but performance reviews, one-to-ones, making sure that those who are working from home are not feeling excluded or overlooked for opportunities. And I guess the risk of a two-tier workforce is another reason why employers may well want to introduce a pilot scheme before they commit to their permanent home working arrangements, or permanent working arrangements rather, to kind of road test what's going to work best for them. And so, but moving back, Luke, to some of those contractual points, you know, what happens, some of those sort of more mundane things, I guess, what happens with expenses? Who will pay the employees' costs to go into the office, for example? Who's going to, you know, are employers going to be expected to contribute towards employees' heating and electricity? Will you put a radius limit, for example, as to how far away from the office a person can live? I've seen quite a bit of chat about that. You know, you could see if somebody's only required to come into the office, say, once a month, they may want to move to a different part of the country. But I guess you have to consider, is that really going to be workable in real terms?
Yeah, I think you identify all key points, which if you're not thinking through now, they're only going to come back and bite you later. The other one for me is the knotty question of salary and allowances. So if, for example, you're paying a London weighting, or your salary scales based on the London market, but you've now got an employee who's going to live and work out of, say, the Scottish borders or wherever, what are you going to try and do to address that? We have seen a number of employers start to tackle that. Allowances may be slightly easier depending on the allowance. Some of those will inevitably just fall away if the person's not regularly attending work. But if you're looking to reduce pay, that's a detrimental change which you'd need to get consent to, which may well be possible if the trade-off is that the employee can remain in post but move to where they've wanted to move to, the Scottish borders or wherever, for example. But it comes back to thinking about those issues now and not letting them linger, because if you don't think about that now, it's obviously going to be much harder to introduce detrimental changes later down the line, and much more difficult to achieve.
Yeah, and just to go off on a slight tangent whilst you're talking about the Scottish borders, I mean, something we've seen quite a lot of, Luke, in the last few months is employees who have gone abroad to stay during the pandemic. Perhaps they've got family abroad, or they've been in the UK on work permits and so on, and they've gone back abroad to work, carrying on the same job. And then we're seeing requests coming in from those employees saying, can they continue to work abroad, you know, once the pandemic is over? And actually that raises all sorts of potential issues, I think, doesn't it, Luke, around tax, pensions, social security, immigration, just to name but a few. So it's worth getting advice if you do get requests like that coming in, I think.
Yeah, you're right. We've had quite a few queries on that, and there are quite a few issues to unpick, so worth getting some advice. Tied into that, I guess one other point I'd make before we go, Kate, is that if you're now going to have people permanently working from home or either part-time working from home, there are a whole host of other issues which should in reality have been addressed when we all got sent home in March last year, believe it or not. But let's be honest, we were all in crisis mode, maybe weren't addressed in quite as much detail as they should have been. So have individuals got the right equipment to do their job? Is their work environment health and safety compliant? Do they need additional insurance? Are you confident that confidential information is kept secure? Are you complying with GDPR, etc.? The list goes on, and you know, they're all important points. I think that if you're thinking about these issues, that you want to make sure they're, if they're not already, sort of neatly covered off in any contract and or any well drafted sort of home working or hybrid working policy.
Yeah, no, good. That's a good point. And speaking of lists going on and on, our conversation could go on and on, Luke. 'Cause it's, as we said at the start, a very interesting topic, but it is time to draw it to a close. You know, we've talked about the multitude of issues really for employers to consider, and those with large workforces in particular, and with people who work differently, have got really quite a lot of planning to do. But you know, it is an exciting time, isn't it? There's a window of opportunity, I think, to do things differently and breathe fresh life into how we work and actually make something good out of the last 12 months moving forwards. But as with more or less everything, and it's a bit of a cliche, it is worth putting the time in to get it right, and to really think how this might work for your business, because those people who I think get it right, those organisations are really going to fly.
Yeah, I think that's right. I'm very conscious that a lot of what we've said today might sound a little bit daunting, but in reality, if I've got the ability to work from home and in the office, that's going to be welcomed by many employees, particularly if you, the employer, get the messaging and the comms around any changes positive, well thought through. So I think many people will be happy to agree to the changes and actually look forward to embracing the new normal, whatever that might actually look like in their business.
Well, Luke, on that happy and positive note, I'm going to let you go. Thank you very much, everybody, for watching this. I hope you've enjoyed it. As you may know, we regularly send out employment updates, briefings, invites to webinars and so on. So if you're not already on our mailing list, do visit www.burgess-salmon.com, where you can sign up to our list. And also we've got lots of information on there, COVID related and otherwise. So plenty to get stuck into. Thank you very much for watching.